Well, the Advocate, of course, is the national publication of record. It started as a newsletter for an upstart, um, fairly radical gay rights group here in Los Angeles in 1967 called The Pride. The group really made its mark after the infamous Black Cat riots here, um, which happened at a little bar. I mean, there was a Black Cat bar in San Francisco, but there was one here in the Silver Lake. So much of gay history has happened here in Silver Lake. This little bar, hole-in-the-wall bar, and we had one of the most notorious homophobic police departments here in LA. Unlike the police department in New York, which had deep connections with the mafia, and they had arranged this elaborate system of kickbacks, we really didn't have that predominant underworld or mafia influence, but we had, unfortunately, one of the most homophobic police departments of any major city in America. They were dreadful. And they had been conducting this decades-long war against gay and lesbian people. And they did something really horrible. Just a few minutes after the bells chimed midnight and brought us into the year 1967, they poured through the doors of this little bar, and the patrons were singing Auld Lang Syne and just, kissing each other on the cheeks and toasting one another for the new year. They went and they started beating everybody up, hitting them with clubs, literally dragging them out. I mean, they beat one man so hard that his spleen burst and they had to rush him to the hospital. Overall, they raided another little neighborhood bar, and altogether, I think they arrested about 16 people and took them to jail for nothing. The charges were lewd behavior or something. Well, this was so egregious that the community rallied, and so about a month and a half later, in February of '67, there was this huge protest involving hundreds, probably about 600 people, gathering on Sunset Boulevard right in front of the bar. And so this little group was one of the promoters of that, and they had this little newsletter, and the Pride newsletter, which was circulated kind of clandestinely behind the bars of the gay watering holes. And that was gay media, as far as we knew it. There had been one magazine here, but that was almost kind of like kind of a spinsterish or, literary journal, but it wasn't like a flaming hot publication. Even back in the 50s, one was writing stories about gays in the military and gay marriage in a thoughtful way, but it only went to, at the most, maybe a few thousand subscribers. So anyway, the Pride newsletter kind of floundered after the group went kaput, as these groups often do after a while. I mean, their mission statement had been more or less fulfilled. And a man by the name of Dick Michaels bought the rights to the newsletter for $1 and turned it into The Advocate. By the following year, 1968, there were, I think the early editions were just 8.5 by 11, and double printed with photos and all of that. I think it was all typed out, the early editions on like an IBM Selectric or something. But they called it the Los Angeles Advocate, and that was the first, as far as I know, regular gay newspaper in America. It was printed clandestinely by gay men working in the basement script printing department of ABC Television, which again is just a few blocks from here in Silver Lake. The newsletter quickly grew and grew, and in short order it became a tabloid-sized newspaper, and then it began to be distributed not just behind bars, but in coin racks, and it quickly grew and was quickly, by 71, 72, was already being well distributed in other cities and really quickly had established itself as the national newspaper, with an LA focus, of course. When Dick Michaels had had enough of all this, I mean, what a exhausting job. He sold it in 1974, late 1974 is my recollection, for around $350,000 to a wealthy multimillionaire by the name of David B. Goodstein, who had been an investment banker on Wall Street and had been transferred to San Francisco, where he was outed out of the closet and was fired. So here's this man of immense wealth and influence, born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and all of a sudden jobless, discriminated against. Well, that can't happen to people like me. So he became an activist too. So he was looking for somewhere to put his money, and the Advocate was for sale, and he bought it, and he moved it out of LA up to the Bay Area where he lived. He lived in Atherton, which was a wealthy suburb there south of the city, and immediately began to upgrade it, give it a new format, bring in younger college-educated writers such as myself. I had started working at the Advocate. They drafted me right out of journalism school, right out of college. So I was like, what was it? I was 23 years old when I started writing my first. These were major. They ended up cover pieces. I was young, and it didn't feel like we were doing anything all that special. I'd always been in the newspaper biz, but as I look back at it now, I'm going, wow, we really did. We were cutting some molds. So of course I had read every issue of the Advocate. One of my jobs early on, when I was not at home, because I was basically a freelancer for a number of years, but they gave me a little work every other week because I had really good graphic and skills, and so I always would help to make up the pages of the paper. I was already then a featured writer for the Advocate magazine, and there I was, centered in San Francisco where the magazine was based. By the late 70s, many of the major important gay writers in New York fell out with the Advocate because of the political machinations of its publisher, David Goodstein, whom I personally liked a great deal, but I could understand why some people would have problems with him because he fancied himself as a power broker. He was a multimillionaire and felt maybe he could let his money do the talking, where in places he should have just been listening. So he did alienate a whole group, which pretty much stayed out of the pages, but I became the cultural affairs editor. I went just from I started with the publication in the summer of 1975, reporting on the burgeoning gay movement in Europe, and I did interview David Hockney in Paris and stuff like that, and then came back and just started writing for them. Lots of cover stories about every topic you could imagine. By '81, with the death of our managing editor, Brent Harris, I was offered the post of, they wanted arts and entertainment. I said, no, that isn't it, because we are now finally at last seeing the birth or the creation of our own distinct culture. Therefore, I want to be called the cultural affairs editor, because I just wasn't doing arts and entertainment. I was editing stories about the early days of AIDS activism and the rise of young performance artists like Tim Miller. That was a little later, but there was a big cultural shift going on.